Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Lauma post-release analysis. Lauma has now been out for a little bit over 2 weeks. There's 5 days left on her banner at the time of recording, and I've had enough time to test her in a bunch of different teams now. So as usual for the post-release, what we do is we go through the pre-release video, talk about whatever we got right, whatever we got wrong, and whatever we missed. So without further ado, let's meet Zajef from 3 weeks ago. Lauma incants a sacred song of the far north. It's a lot of yacht, but it basically means you get 18 stacks by default, but you can get another 18 stacks from consuming Verdant Dew from your skill. Because what Pale Him does, as we're gonna see, is it buffs your bloom reactions. You'll only ever get them in teams where you get Lunar Bloom and therefore get Verdant Dew and therefore have 3 stacks of Moon Song. In other words, this is always 36. One thing I want to add to this is one of the things that you can do with Lauma, which is you can intentionally not use your hold E. Let me explain to you how that works. First, let's just take a look at how much damage my Hyperblooms do by default. So my Hyperblooms hit for 8.5k here. When I use Lauma's Burst, 15,314. It's pretty clear to see which ones are buffed and which ones aren't. The damage isn't supposed to be double. This is because my Rhydon doesn't have any artifacts. But I just want to show something specific here. Once you're past your first rotation, you'll start with 3 Verdant Dews. So let's start with 3 Verdant Dews. Right? And take a look at what happens here if we hold E into Q. Our Q finishes resolving at 9 minutes 39 seconds. And if we start triggering Hyperbloom, 20 seconds later, at this time, our Hyperblooms are back to doing 8.5k. If we do something a little bit different here, and we don't hold E after the first burst, or before the first burst, we tap E instead. Alright, we start with a 15,000 at around 50. And then, on the next E, we hold E at 40. As you can see here, okay, or maybe as you can't see because it's being annoying, we're still hitting for 15k on our Hyperblooms, even almost 30 seconds after a burst. This is just a specific tech that you can do in teams that have longer rotations and where Lauma doesn't end up with that many buffs and that many stats, so her Lunar Bloom damage doesn't do that much. And you can basically alternate tap E and hold E to make it so that instead of having 36 stacks you can use in 15 seconds, you have 18 stacks, and then 12 seconds later, another 18 stacks. And because the timer for each stack is calculated independently, gaining your stacks from your hold E after your burst, instead of from your burst after your hold E, allows you to carry that buff over for an additional, 12-ish seconds. Because you use it about 12 seconds later, and it's still 15 seconds. But you still have the base 18 from the burst for the first 12 seconds. In teams where you don't trigger 36 Hyperblooms or Blooms or whatever in 15 seconds, which is pretty much every team except Nilou teams. In Nilou teams, in AoE, it can happen. But in pretty much any single target team for Hyperbloom, this is a thing that you can do. I personally like doing this a lot more because it allows me to not have to worry too much about the power of my Lauma build. I don't have to care too much about her crit. At a baseline, you don't care that much about her crit, and you care about it even less if you only hold every other E. Anyways, that's something I didn't mention in the pre-release that I figured out later. You get a buff based on your moon sign, and the buffs do not stack, so you only get one of these 2 buffs. Let's start with the Ascendant Gleam one, the second one. All party members, Lunar Bloom damage, crit rate plus 10%, crit damage plus 20%. Lunar Bloom damage, right, like we said earlier, works the exact same way as Lunar Charge damage, but just doesn't get the additional ×3. It's basically just damage that doesn't scale with damage percent and scales with EM instead. So it's 40 CV to your damage. However, on release, the only character that does Lunar Bloom damage is Lauma. And while her skill is a nice little chunk of damage, it's not enough for her to carry the team. So this doesn't doesn't tend to be that big of an upgrade to your team DPS. Yeah, one thing about that is if you've looked at any of the like speed runs with Lauma, because the crab enemy is like Omega hyper boosted for carry Lauma, that passive matters a lot there, but it's not a real thing. Anyways, we now have legs on Nefer. Nefer is indeed a Lunar Bloom carry, and 40 CV on Nefer is pretty nice. Who would have thought? Nascent Gleam. Bloom, Hyperbloom, and Burgeon damage dealt by all nearby party members can crit. 15% crit rate, crit damage fixed at 100%. In other words, because initially your reactions can't crit, you have a 15% chance of them doing double damage, which is the equivalent of a 15% multiplicative DPS increase. And it stacks with other sources of crit rate, which right now is pretty much just Nahida's C2. In pretty much every team, this effect is better than this effect, which means getting a... For now, right? So long as Nefer isn't out yet. But on Nefer, the second one is obviously a lot better. Her skill, her burst, and her passives all increase your Hyperbloom damage. It's actually about a 40%. For comparison, Nahida's Constellation 2 is just 20 crit, it's times 1.2, a 20% DPS increase. So this is more. I don't think we need to rewatch everything here. Yeah, no surprise, she is indeed better than Nahida. Weapons, I don't think anything's changed. Put the loot in the bag, little bro. If you missed the event, you can use Fav or Black Marrow Lantern. They're both okay, but... Artifact sets! Honestly, just put her on one of the support sets. Whether it be Serenade or Deepwood. You want one Serenade and one Deepwood on your team. Doesn't matter who's on who, just make sure you've got both. Deepwood is more important than Serenade, but it's always nice to have both. What are the ER requirements? In an average, normal Hyperbloom team, let's say a 21-second rotation with Mualani. We can skip to the conclusion here. I've kind of changed my mind on this one, right? In the pre-release, I talked about how you could burst off cooldown in teams that have flexible rotations instead of just once per rotation exactly. But I feel like if you're going to be maximizing burst uptime, you're kind of better off using the trick I talked about earlier of alternating tap E and hold E to extend burst duration instead of using burst more often. Because the burst animation is pretty long and you lose like normal attacks or your Mualani and Mualani application in Hyperbloom teams or uptime on your other characters and other teams. And I think you're generally just better off only bursting once per rotation and just doing one tappy, one holdy to extend burst duration. Which means that her ER requirements are a bit lower than I gave them credit for here, and it makes it a lot easier to get away with triple EM in almost every team. Bloom with Nilou is getting a massive buff. Nilou is most definitely by far the biggest beneficiary of Lauma. Nilou went from a character that in single target is completely worthless and in AoE is honestly not even as good as other okay-ish carries. Like, it is on a similar level to the other okay-ish carries in AoE, to actually on a similar level to the other okay-ish carries in single target, and actually very good in AoE. The team DPS increase to Nilou teams is hovering somewhere between like 50 and 70%, and that paired with the direct buff to the Bloom reaction, where they reduced the self-damage from triggering Bloom and triggering Burgeon, and I guess Hyperbloom if you're really close to the enemy hitbox, but they reduced the recoil damage from Bloom by a lot. It's now 2% of the damage instead of 5%, which allows you to run less healing on your healers and more EM for reactions. It's a big deal. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but in this, I talked about Kave as a healer option. I talked about Kogomi potentially needing to build healing. This was before I knew about the reduction of recoil damage. And now I'd say that, honestly, like, Kave Lauma died before Lauma even came out. It's not that you can't play it, it's that the biggest upside of Kave is that it trivializes your healing requirements. And the healer options that heal a lot in Nilou teams don't tend to be that good for application. Now, you don't need the healer options that heal a lot. You can get away with even something like Barbara on a full EM build and it still heals enough. You can still play Kave if you want. Kave is a viable Dendro slot, just like he's always been. I don't think I talked about Bloom without Nilou in this video at all. Lauma is strong enough to make Bloom without Nilou playable. I would say that Bloom with Lauma without Nilou is probably stronger than Bloom with Nilou was before Lauma came out, but not by much. It's like on a similar level. Also, you're probably better off just playing Burgeon at that point. All of the Lauma buffs together, plus Lauma's slightly higher personal damage over Nahida in a Hyperbloom team, generally represent a team DPS upgrade of somewhere between 30 and 40%. Honestly, at KQM standard, these Lauma Hyperbloom teams are going to be closer to Skirk and Mawika than they are to, like, Knight. But at higher investment, some of the teams that are below Hyperbloom with Lauma will catch up a little. From what I've looked at so far with the assumptions I have, Lauma Hyperbloom is somewhere in between Varissa and Skirk in terms of DPS. At really high investment, Varissa probably catches up, maybe goes slightly ahead. I slightly overestimated the amount of Hyperblooms you get in these double Hydro Hyperbloom teams. It's actually around Varissa rather than slightly above. But that's actually not the only sort of Hyperbloom team you'll play. As it turns out, 25% Hydro Shred is pretty nice for Hydro carries. Let's start with Neuvillette. Another patch, another Neuvillette buff. Who could have seen that one coming? Indeed, it is a Neuvillette buff. Yet another very good Neuvillette team. You don't need Inefa, you can do it with Raiden as well. Personally, I actually like the Raiden version a bit more. They're both fairly solid. Worth mentioning, I've played some, like, Bloom Neuvillette, where you go Neuvillette on a normal build with, like, Lauma Nahida or Lauma Baiju with Farina. And in AoE, it was actually, like, pretty good. I don't know how I feel about that. It makes me a little bit upset, but now you're cursed with that knowledge just as much as I am, so at least I can find solace in that knowledge. I'd feel pretty comfortable in saying that Neuvillette, Inefa, Lauma, Farina is the third best team in the game, like for C0 stuff, after Mawika and Skirk. I don't think I've changed my mind on that. Oh yeah, also another thing I wanted to quickly mention. We've had very sus Durin leaks that suggest that he's going to be an off-field Pyro that gives some shred to Pyro, Animo, and Hydro. If that is indeed the case, it is very possible that Burgeon Neuvillette with Durin is going to become the best team in the game. Another patch, another Neuvillette buff strikes again. Not entirely, like it is what it is, man. Like I'm looking forward to it. Hell yeah. But there's actually another Hydro carry that can work with Lauma. So let's talk about Mualani. In a team like this, Lauma is just better than Nahida. Lauma effectively does the same thing, but doesn't need to use a 3-second movie-length animation. Would I recommend pulling for Lauma to improve your Mualani team? No. However, if you end up going for Lauma, there are going to be situations where maybe the content favors using Burning, like Lava Dragon or something like that, and Lauma is actually a good option for you. Yeah, I'll say, compared to Nahida, after doing a bit of testing on those teams, Lauma feels a little bit better, but the difference doesn't feel that impactful. So it's kind of up to you, honestly. Another nice thing is that, unlike Nahida, Lauma's skill duration is only 15 seconds. And you might be thinking, what do you mean, a nice thing, only 15 seconds? Because, as it turns out, Nahida's very long skill duration can make it difficult to properly get the right buffs on the second rotation. Scrolls will only buff the elements that are involved in the reactions you trigger, which means if you can't apply Hydro as an aura, your scroll support won't buff your Mualani. And it's difficult to apply a Hydro aura through Nahida. 1.5U Dendro that lasts forever, you're never getting a second Hydro Crystallize with Shilonen or something like that. With Lauma, it can, because the Dendro just expires after a while. Yeah, in practice, this kind of matters, but also kind of doesn't, because while it does allow for you to get your buffs refreshed earlier, it's not early enough that it doesn't extend your rotation time. So it isn't necessarily worth waiting for the Dendro app to be over. So let's talk about Knight. TDDS plus 25 shred is actually kind of enough to compete in Knight's teams. Is she great for Knight's teams? No. But is she good enough to consider skipping Emily, to consider skipping Mawika for your Knight team, to consider, let's say you're in a Sidon Onslaught version that doesn't have a good boss for Lauma at all, to consider using Lauma on Knight so you can use Mawika carry somewhere else? Yeah, she is good enough for that. Otherwise, there's also Burgeon stuff, but honestly, Burgeon is kind of bait anyways, so. Okay, I will stand by Burgeon on Knight being very bait, but I don't think I actually talk about just straight up Burgeon teams in here. And that's something I talked about in the first impressions video that I posted after my first day of testing. Burgeon is reasonable now. Buffs to Bloom that reduced recoil damage, also reduced Burgeon recoil damage, to the point where it's now pretty easy to break even on Burgeon outgoing damage and Toma shielding, even on a Toma full EM build. So you don't need a healer at all, basically, in Burgeon teams anymore, if you're using Toma as your trigger. That paired with just how big of a like damage upgrade Lauma is to Bloom reactions, including Burgeon, it's pretty nice. It's pretty damn nice. Burgeon teams are pretty solid now. Like they're not as good as Nilou teams in AoE, but they work. They're all right. If you don't have Nilou, you can get away pretty easily with a Burgeon team. And that pretty much does it for the teams. Lauma's pretty good. She is definitely balanced around C0R0 stuff. It seems to me like Lauma is supposed to be the sort of character that is one of the strongest characters in the meta when you look at C0R0 stuff, but is pretty forgettable for people who go for constellations on characters. Maybe that won't be the case because Nefer has some pretty good early cons and a good signature and really wants Lauma on her team. So, but overall, I'd say that the main two misses from this pre-release are the tap E hold E alternate and that I completely ignored Burgeon. But outside of those two things, I think pretty much everything was fairly accurate. I'd say that right now, Lauma feels fairly strong, and the current Sidon Onslaught and the upcoming Sidon Onslaught they're designed to sell the new characters. So she's gonna feel maybe even better than she should, at least for the next, like, 2 months, basically. Will that stay the case in the long term? Well, I think she's good enough that she'll at least feel solid, but I definitely do think it's not going to feel as good in the long term as it feels now. In any case, that's going to be it for the post-release. As usual, I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.